Hello and welcome to another episode of Reviews Redux, where I take another look at one of my older reviews and bring it up to my more current quality standards. In this particular instance, we're going to be taking a look at Mass Effect 3 along with all of its DLCs, including its single-player DLCs From Ashes, Extended Cut, Omega, Citadel, and Leviathan, as well as the multiplayer DLCs, which are not really going to factor into this video too much, but I did want to at least mention them when I talk about the multiplayer component of the game. What you're going to be seeing throughout this video is of the normal PC version of the game, the original standard Mass Effect 3, as opposed to the fairly recently released Mass Effect Legendary Edition, which is also available, which of course brings the sum total of all of the systems this game is available on to the original release being on PC, Xbox 360, PlayStation 3, and Wii U, and Legendary Edition expands that to PlayStation 4 and Xbox One as well. And before I go any further with this video, I do want to mention that the Wii U version specifically does not have all of the DLC available. More specifically, the Wii U version shipped with Extended Cut and From Ashes included on the disc, but it never got the Leviathan, Omega, or Citadel DLCs, so you can't actually get the complete Mass Effect 3 experience on the Wii U version, which is unfortunate, but that's also kind of the reality of the Wii U versions of just about anything, unfortunately. Now then, with all of that said, this is an action role-playing game and the sequel to Mass Effect 2. It is the conclusion of Commander Shepard's storyline, and it was released to a pretty weird reception. Because when the game released, it was the subject of a massive amount of controversy over its endings, which were generally seen as absolutely terrible, even if you weren't really a Mass Effect fan. If you were a Mass Effect fan, they were downright insulting. Now, you have to understand where I'm coming from on this. I played through this game on launch, in its original form, and I got through to the very end of the game, got up to the endings, and was just left in awe of how absolutely atrocious the endings were. The original endings of the game basically amounted to a cutscene that was tinted either red, green, or blue, depending on an arbitrary choice you make at the end of the game. It was completely anticlimactic no matter which choice you made, and it ended up basically invalidating every single choice and every single plot point that was made in both of the previous games. It was truly a work of art in how to completely botch the ending of a trilogy, and it generated enough controversy and fan rage that eventually BioWare did put out the Extended Cut DLC, which retools the endings so they are more distinct than simply red, green, or blue tinting on the same cutscene, and adds a few extra scenes on top of that, which was generally seen as a step in the right direction, but it still didn't quite fix all the issues there. The other problem that this game had immediately on launch was that content was locked behind a paywall. Specifically, if you didn't get one of the deluxe editions of the game, you didn't get the From Ashes DLC, which once you actually mess around with it, you realize was not really DLC. It was content that they cut out of the game and sold as an extra. And sure, you can go through the entire game without Javik. He is not an essential character to the game as far as its story goes, but he has massive lore implications. He is the last living Prothean. That's a big friggin' deal in the Mass Effect universe. And they decided to not only lock him behind a paywall, but they had the gall to make him Day 1 DLC. If they had released him later on, then people wouldn't have been as upset, but Day 1 DLC, where it's pretty painfully obvious that they just pulled this content out of the game because it wasn't technically essential, but it really is essential if you're a Mass Effect fan, it's just incredibly scummy. And then on top of all of that, they had the controversy over Tali's face, which you do actually get to see in this if you pursue a relationship with her, except that they made it a really bad Photoshop of a stock photo, and people were not happy about that at all. And unfortunately, with the original release of the game, they never fixed this. They were just basically like, whatever, it's not a big deal. But when Legendary Edition rolled around, they did replace the crappy Photoshop with an actual CG image that looks a hell of a lot better. So at least they addressed that eventually. It just took them forever to do that. And there was the fairly baffling decision to put Jessica Chobot in the game as a fairly important character that will accompany you throughout basically the entire story, which is incredibly weird. I mean, cameos are one thing, but this was actually kind of ridiculous. And then, of course, there was the controversy over the way they implemented male homosexual relationships into the game, which was basically a first for the Mass Effect series. Because in the previous games, while FemShep had some options if she wanted to get together with a female character, Male Shep didn't really have any options for getting together with other guys, so they decided to fix that problem in Mass Effect 3. The problem being that if you have 2 games behind this, where that wasn't really an option, it ends up being kind of awkwardly shoehorned in, and that's mostly why people were bothered by it. But you know what? As awkwardly handled as it was in Mass Effect 3, at least it wasn't as bad as Dragon Age 2 in that regard, but that's a topic for another video entirely. My ultimate point here is that there is a lot of baggage associated with Mass Effect 3, whether it be general controversies like the ones I've already talked about, or my own personal experience with the game. It's been a long time since I've played it, but I still vividly remember how livid I was when I finished the game and just had those downright insulting endings thrown in my face. I mean, I very, very rarely will pre-order anything, but I did pre-order Mass Effect 3 because I enjoyed Mass Effect 1 and 2 so much, even though they certainly had their flaws. Mass Effect 3 was a game I was really looking forward to, and it ended up being a massive disappointment. Even once the Extended Cut DLC came out, it was still an incredibly disappointing experience. And then time went on, the additional DLCs came out, and while I picked up all the multiplayer ones because they were free, all the story content was fairly expensive, so I just decided, you know what, I'm going to wait until there's a bundle available. But that didn't happen for many years after the game's release. Obviously now, they do have DLC bundles available for the standard version of the game that I have, and of course if you get Legendary Edition, then all of the DLC is just included right from the get-go, except for all the multiplayer stuff, because they actually removed the multiplayer from the Legendary Edition entirely. Of course, this game's been out long enough that basically all the dust has settled. I mean, it released in 2012, so it's been almost a full decade at this point since the game originally released. And that's been long enough that I feel comfortable being pretty objective about it, especially since I'm going through all the DLCs for this particular video, which is something I did not do in my original review. And I didn't do in a follow-up video either, because I just didn't have the DLCs back then. And now that I have just rambled your ear off throughout all of this, let's actually go ahead and get down to business here. Let us take a look at Mass Effect 3 for what it is, not what people say it is. Not what people think it is from about a decade ago. What it actually is as a video game, as a sequel to Mass Effect 2, and of course Mass Effect 1, and a conclusion to the Shepard storyline. Let's just go ahead and start delving right in. And like always, we'll go ahead and start with the presentation, which runs on Unreal Engine 3 and is a general step up over Mass Effect 2 in terms of raw visual fidelity. The modeling in particular is noticeably better than in the previous game, and in several instances the textures are also better quality, although you do notice a lot more of the background stuff tends to be a lower visual quality than you would see in the previous games, and I think a lot of that was that they were trying to squeeze as much as they could out of the engine at the end of the Xbox 360 and PS3's lifespan. That said, they did overdo it just a bit on some of the bloom lighting here and there, as well as some of the lens flares, which they intensified in this compared to the previous games, which had some fairly intense lens flares in them. So that can be a bit annoying sometimes, but other than that, the only other issues with visual fidelity are things like some of the animations being a bit stiffer and more robotic, as well as some of the lip syncing being really off, which is not all that unusual for that era, so it's not really something to hold majorly against the game. Although with as many close-ups as the game has, that can be a bit annoying here and there. And of course the rather narrow FOV, which can get on your nerves after a while, but thankfully this is a third-person game, so it is a bit less of an issue than it would be if this were a first-person game. There were, however, some changes to the visuals that may not necessarily go over quite as well as the generally somewhat better visual fidelity, which are the changes to the game's art style. Namely things like changing around some of the uniforms, and the new uniforms looking a lot worse, as well as their decision to reduce the color palette of the game. It's not that the game doesn't have color, it certainly has plenty of color, it's just that a lot of them are a lot more washed out in this game than what you would see in the previous entries, and you end up with something that looks a lot dingier and a lot less, well, Mass Effect. It certainly doesn't go quite as far as the truly obnoxious BGR bullshit that you would see in a lot of other games around that time, particularly things like modern military shooters and such, but it is one of those really cheap ways that developers tried to make games darker and grittier back then, and it just didn't really work. That's not to say they completely destroyed the art style of Mass Effect or anything, they certainly didn't, it's just that it doesn't really look quite as good as the previous games, despite improvements in visual fidelity. Then you move over into sound design and you end up with something of a mixed bag. On the one hand, the consistently good voice acting in the Mass Effect series returns in this, and is arguably the best it's been in the entire series. With the exception of Mordin Solus, who is now voiced by a new actor, the rest of the voice cast makes a return from previous games, if their characters manage to survive, of course, and they all do a pretty fantastic job for the most part. And as for the new actor for Mordin, he did a pretty fantastic job as well. In fact, he did such a good job you can barely notice a difference, which is very impressive. In addition to the excellent voice acting, there's also some very solid sound effects, particularly with regards to the weapon and explosion sounds, which are a bit beefier than they were in previous entries. Although, to be fair, since we are dealing with mass accelerator weapons instead of propellant-powered guns like we would in pretty much any other shooter, they're not going to have the same kind of punchiness than a normal gun sound effect would. Explosions, on the other hand, do have a bit more impact behind them than the other games in the series, so that's definitely nice. And then, of course, there is the music, which is a bit of a mixture of styles. Instead of going primarily with the electronic stuff like they did in the original Mass Effect, and the more orchestral stuff like they did in Mass Effect 2, they tried to mix the two together quite a lot more, and it mostly works okay, although it doesn't quite have the same kind of epic feel that the soundtrack did in Mass Effect 2, and it doesn't quite have the same incredibly distinct sound that the Mass Effect 1 soundtrack did. Still, it does a good job accentuating the moment-to-moment gameplay, and it still sounds enough like Mass Effect to where it's not really a problem that they tried to mix the styles of both 1 and 2, and didn't really do it quite as successfully as you might hope. And when you bring all the presentation together, you end up with something that is very solid overall, as befitting a AAA game like this. But of course, what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and I'm actually going to do things a bit different for this particular video and talk about the gameplay first, then talk about the story. So what are you dealing with in the gameplay department? Well, this is still the hybrid of third-person shooter with action role-playing game, meaning that you have a selection of character classes that you can choose that will give you a different set of abilities, and over time you will level up and be able to spend your skill points on improving your various abilities. And while upgrading those abilities is a linear path, eventually they do start giving you the ability to choose between one of two different variants for your particular ability. Say, for example, you have one that might give you more power, but the other branch might give you a faster recharge time. So that gives you the ability to customize your skills a bit more than what you saw in Mass Effect 2, where it was just a straight linear upgrade path. And this change to the upgrade system does apply to both Shepard and the squad mates, so you can actually get a fair bit of customization going on in your various squad loadouts. And speaking of loadouts, they did change up the equipment system a bit as well. The armor system more or less returns intact from Mass Effect 2, but the weapon system has been overhauled to allow you to put various attachments on your weapons. This can do things like give you spare thermal clips, or increase the capacity of the thermal clips that are in your weapons, or give your weapons additional damage, or the ability to pierce through cover, and things like that. It's a bit of a hybrid system between what you saw in the original Mass Effect, where you had various categories of weapons that all behaved the same, but you could apply various attachments to give them some static bonuses, and the approach that Mass Effect 2 took, where you don't have the ability to customize your weapons, but the weapons themselves each have specific traits that really set them apart from one another, as opposed to all just behaving exactly the same with some stat differences, like in the original game. So in this, you have the weapons each having their own individual traits that set them apart from one another, and you have a return to being able to customize those weapons, although definitely not quite in the same way you had in the original game. These overhauls are also accompanied by overhauls to the general combat system, where now you have sprinting being an infinite resource as opposed to being only able to sprint for a very brief period of time. You actually sprint a fair bit faster than you did in the previous games, and you have a smoother cover system to where you'll move in and out of cover a bit more quickly than you saw in Mass Effect 2, and you can also transition between cover a lot more easily. It's certainly not perfect, however, and a lot of that stems from the way the controls are set up. You see, it wouldn't necessarily be a problem if you had separate buttons for sprinting, cover, and interact, but they combined them all into one button, presumably because it supposedly works a bit better on a gamepad, but the end result is that you'll find yourself getting in and out of cover when you actually mean to be interacting with something. You might try sprinting when you're actually trying to get into cover. It ends up being a bit messy sometimes. So even though in theory the system is better than it was in the previous games, that's only when it's actually working properly, which is most of the time, to be fair, but when it does start not working correctly, it will start getting on your nerves. This wasn't the only change they made to the general combat mechanics, however. They also introduced the idea of a heavy melee attack, where you hold down the melee button and you will do a charged attack that has a wind-up but does a lot more damage. You can also use this as a sort of takedown by going into cover in front of an enemy and making sure that the cover is thin enough to where you can actually reach the opponent over it, and when the appropriate icon appears on the cover, which is a fist, then you can hold down the melee button and instead of doing a heavy attack like you normally would, you will actually grab the enemy, pull them over the cover, and then finish them off. And as you might expect, that's actually pretty satisfying when you do manage to pull it off, especially considering that the enemy will actively try to get away from you and will actively try to flush you out of cover at pretty much every opportunity. The enemy AI has been generally improved in that regard. They will actually utilize tactics a bit more. Enemies that have stronger melee capabilities will actually try to rush you and hit you with those melee abilities because they do a lot of damage and they can actually break through your shields rather easily. Enemies will actually utilize an implementation of suppress and flank tactics where they'll have some guys shooting at you to try to keep you in cover while others are trying to flank around you, and while it's not exactly the most complicated tactics around, it's definitely more of a challenge to deal with than what you had in the previous games. And while the RPG mechanics do certainly factor into how much damage you're doing, and you'll also need to be aware of enemies with shielding or armor or barriers, because each of those have their own strengths and weaknesses you'll have to deal with, things like changing your ammo type so you actually do more damage against whatever you're going up against, or hit them with abilities that will, say, weaken their armor or do more damage against it, or will try to disrupt their shielding or barriers or things like that. And there's even the implementation of ability combos, where you might hit them with one ability that will apply a status effect, and then you can hit them with another ability that will actually detonate that and cause a large explosion in a radius around them, which does quite a lot of damage and is rather satisfying to do. They do try to balance out some of these things by giving you a power recharge rate that is influenced by the weight of the weapons you're carrying, so you do need to balance out your actual loadout with what kind of power usage you're really going for. Say if you're playing a soldier and you're not as reliant on powers, you might get more weaponry because you don't really need to worry about replenishing your powers frequently. But if you are something like, say, a Vanguard, then because your class is mainly centered around using your biotic abilities, you'll want to make sure that you have as fast a recharge rate as possible on that, so you'll need to keep a much closer eye on the weapons you're carrying and make sure that the weight doesn't go too far with them. And these changes to the loadout system, as well as the skills and the general combat mechanics, mix in with the introduction of a pretty decent variety of enemy types, from basic infantry to shielded infantry that you have to either knock the shield out of their hands or be able to shoot through the very small eye slit that's in the shield, along with enemies that cloak or teleport or charge you or hit you with ranged attacks that throw grenades at you to flush you out of cover, any number of things like that, ultimately resulting in a pretty good variety of combat situations you'll find yourself in throughout the entire game. And on top of that, they've also made the game a bit more challenging than the previous games by reintroducing the health mechanic from the original game, where you had a health bar in addition to your shielding or barriers, and when your barrier or shielding depletes, you start taking health damage. Unlike in the original Mass Effect, however, Mass Effect 3's health system involves a series of pips on the health bar, and as you continue to take damage, those pips will gradually deplete. You will automatically heal up to the maximum of the pip you're on, but if you want to replenish all of your health, then you need to use Metagel, which is also used for reviving your squad mates. In other words, like with a lot of things that I've already discussed, this is a bit of a hybrid between the original Mass Effect's health system, where it had the health bar and then it had the shielding, and shielding regenerated automatically, whereas the health bar had to be replenished with Metagel, and Mass Effect 2, where you had your shielding, and once that depleted, you could only take a few more hits before you went down, but when you waited for your shielding to recharge, your health recharged along with it. But here's the interesting thing about all of the changes to the combat mechanics in Mass Effect 3 compared to its predecessors. The original game's combat mechanics were frankly just crap, and anybody who argues otherwise is just wrong. Mass Effect 2's combat mechanics were certainly better, but like with a lot of cover-based shooters where they don't entirely know what they're doing, it ended up being a pretty static affair most of the time, meaning that you ended up being stuck behind cover most of the time and just poked out to take a few shots and then go back into cover every so often. Mass Effect 3, on the other hand, still has the taking cover and poking out to take a few shots here and there, but because the enemy AI has been improved enough to where they will actually deliberately try to flank you and flush you out of cover as much as possible, you're actually moving around a lot more than you did in both of the previous games. And between all of that and the enhanced feedback you get from the gunplay, where if you get headshots with sufficiently powerful weapons, then it will actually blow the enemies' heads off, and if you hit enemies with sufficiently powerful abilities and weapons in general, then it will cause them to explode entirely into just a shower of gore, as well as the weirdly satisfying melee takedowns where you grab the enemy, pull them over the cover, and then finish them off, ultimately results in the best combat out of the entire Mass Effect series. That does even include Andromeda, which is arguably better from a mechanics standpoint, but it just doesn't have the same kind of panache that the combat in Mass Effect 3 does. Now sure, not every combat encounter in the game is all that well designed, but for the most part they do a very good job with it, and when everything's firing on all cylinders, the combat in Mass Effect 3 is actually pretty good for an action RPG. Which is a very good thing, because that's going to be what you're doing throughout almost the entirety of the game. Now don't get me wrong, Mass Effect 1 and 2 both had their fair share of combat, with the second one especially being much more of a third-person shooter than the first game, but Mass Effect 3 is actually more of a third-person shooter than it is a role-playing game. All the role-playing elements are still definitely there, you are still making choices as Shepard, and those choices do have consequences, some of which are actually 2 games in the making, and it does still have things like interrupts, where you'll be going through a dialogue or a cutscene, and it will give you a prompt for either a Paragon or a Renegade interrupt, and you can do that to make the conversation or cutscene go in a different direction. You do still have Paragon and Renegade as a system in the game, where you will gradually gain reputation, and as you gain reputation, you will have Paragon and Renegade points associated with it, and sometimes those will give you additional dialogue options when you're in the middle of a conversation. There are still plenty of side quests you can go on, there's still plenty of codex entries you can find, and you can actually do a bit of exploration around the galaxy as well by flying around the galaxy map and using scans to find various anomalies, whether that be various things that you can use in side quests or just resources, which is usually going to be fuel when you're out on the galaxy map, and fuel is used to go between systems once you've made a jump through the mass relays. The thing is, while the elements you would expect after having played Mass Effect 1 and 2 are certainly in Mass Effect 3, in most cases, they're actually pared down. For example, the exploration and the scanning mechanics. Well, in Mass Effect 2, you had a whole thing where you would scan a planet and you would be able to send out probes to get materials, and then you could spend those various resources you found on upgrades for the ship, upgrades for your crew, or just upgrades for whatever equipment you happen to have. Here, the scanning mechanic is definitely in the game, but most of what you're doing is actually just flying around the galaxy map and sending out a scan pulse that will find an anomaly on a given planet or just somewhere in a system, and then you'll go over to that and it will either automatically find whatever the thing is. For example, if it's some ship wreckage, then you'll just find it, and if it's a planet, then it will go into the scanning interface that you had with the previous game, but you're not doing that for resources or anything like that. You're only going to one specific point on that planet, and once you've found that thing, then that's it. Now sure, scanning for resources in Mass Effect 2 got quite tiresome, but it still was a mechanic that was actually used, whereas in this, the scanning is more or less pointless. I mean, you already find the anomaly by sending out the pulse. There's no need to go to a scanner interface to narrow that down, really. Of course, an associated change with this is with regards to the upgrade system, where in the previous game you would get those resources and then spend those to give yourself upgrades. In this, the upgrades you either just find as you're wandering around, or you go to shops and you just buy them with the game's currency of credits, which you'll be earning a fair bit of as you play through the game, because you'll just be finding random things in the environment that you can scan or salvage just for a few extra credits, and of course you get a fair number of credits whenever you complete a quest. And you'll find that over time you'll just be gradually collecting a bunch of weapons and weapon mods and such that all have a number after them. It's just starts at 1 and it goes up from there, and with each numerical increase, the weapon or mod just gets better. So if you find additional weapon mods, for example, as you're wandering around, and you find that those match the ones you already have, then you're just going to get a numerical upgrade for it, and it's just going to increase its stats. And while that certainly seems like a fairly bland way of handling equipment progression, it actually makes a bit more sense this time around when compared to, for example, Mass Effect 1, where it did basically the same thing, except there was no real variety between all the weapons you were using. Here, you do actually have a good amount of weapon variety, and those weapons do behave differently from one another, so you are getting a bit more bang for your buck, even if it is just a linear upgrade path for each of these things. But while that's all very straightforward, and the changes to the scanning system are arguably better considering how annoying scanning was in Mass Effect 2, and here it's just something you don't have to deal with anywhere near as much, unfortunately, there were some mechanics that were pared down that really shouldn't have been. In fact, they should have been expanded, namely the dialogue system. Now, Mass Effect 1 had the dialogue wheel, and Mass Effect 2 continued this. Mass Effect 3 technically continues this, but for the vast majority of conversations in the game, you're only going to have 2 or 3 options. One of those options might be investigate, which allows you to just ask some questions about things and they might answer them, and the other 2 are going to be your actual conversation movers, the things you say to move the conversation forward, and in most cases they have been sorted into a simple Paragon and Renegade option. The only real exceptions to this are when the game gives you those Paragon and Renegade specific options that unlock after you hit a certain Paragon and Renegade reputation level. The thing is, while that sort of thing was present in the previous Mass Effect games, it's not only more glaringly obvious that it's this way in Mass Effect 3, but the actual dialogue choices are so much more rigid than what you saw in the previous games that it sometimes makes you wonder if the developers even wanted to give you the choice of dialogue at all. And whenever those Paragon and Renegade options come up where it's based on reputation level, those are going to be the optimal solutions for whatever that particular dialogue is. You will always get more out of those than you will out of the standard options. It's not really a choice in that regard. Because be honest with yourself, if you're given 4 dialogue options and one of them is Paragon, one of them is Renegade, and then the other 2 are just Paragon but better and Renegade but better, why would you choose anything but the but better options? And it certainly doesn't help that the Paragon and Renegade options in Mass Effect 3 are just not as well written as they were in the previous games. You see, if you're not really all that familiar with the Paragon and Renegade system, it can more or less be boiled down as Paragon is not necessarily good, but it is diplomatic. It is working together with other people and trying to avoid violence whenever you can. whereas Renegade was envisioned as not necessarily evil, but get the job done at any cost. The problem is that when you hit Mass Effect 3, the options are a bit more vague in the actual text displays, and the end results of what you're choosing are a lot more dramatic this time around. So while Paragon is usually more of the same kind of stuff you saw from Paragon in the first two games, but a bit more goody two-shoes this time around, whereas the Renegade options in Mass Effect 3 usually turn Shepard into an asshole at absolute best and a raging psychopath at absolute worst. And to make matters worse, as if that weren't bad enough, they went a step further with a lot of the Renegade options, to where they're just bad decisions. They end up with you being worse off in just about every conceivable way than if you had just gone Paragon. That's certainly not to say that Renegade is a completely non-viable way of playing the game. You certainly can play through the entire thing with a Renegade playthrough and do fine. It's just that a lot of the decisions are going to leave a bad taste in your mouth. The thing is, this mostly applies only to the actual Renegade dialogue options, not the Renegade interrupts of all things. The interrupts are usually fine. It's just the dialogue options that end up being a mess in that regard, and I really don't know why they did it this way. The thing is, the changes to the dialogue system and the changes to the overall philosophy of Paragon versus Renegade are starting to lead me more into the writing side of things. But before I talk about the writing, I do want to talk about the multiplayer, which if you have Legendary Edition, you can't play. They removed the multiplayer from Legendary Edition entirely, but it is still technically playable in the original version of the game, although good luck finding other players unless you just get a few buddies together and you set up a private game with them. That's not something I was able to do for this particular video, mainly because my schedule is a nightmare for trying to figure things like that out, so I ended up doing them solo, which is something else you can do here. Although since the multiplayer mode is really not balanced around that at all, completing some of the objectives, especially on the higher difficulty settings if you're playing by yourself, is extremely difficult, if not outright impossible. But what exactly is the gameplay of the multiplayer mode? Well, it is a cooperative mode with up to 4 player support, and the core gameplay of it is more or less a fairly basic horde mode, where you're going up against waves of increasingly powerful enemies over time, and when you eliminate all of the enemies in that wave, it will move on to the next wave. As you progress through the waves, you will gradually be given additional objectives you need to complete in order for the mission to be a success. These are enabling various devices, and being given specific enemies to target and having to eliminate them in a short time frame. Additional objectives were also introduced in a couple of the multiplayer DLCs. Specifically, the Rebellion Pack introduced the retrieval mechanic, where you are given 2 packages that you need to transport back to an extraction zone, and whenever you're carrying those, you move at a rather slow walking pace, and if you try to dodge or run or anything like that, you drop the package. And the other objective, which was added into the game, was done so with the Earth DLC, and that was an escort mode, where it spawns in a drone and you have to accompany it while it goes towards an extraction point. While any of these objectives are active, enemies will just continue to spawn in. It won't be like with the other waves where there's a finite number of enemies spawning in. So you'll want to complete the objectives as soon as you possibly can. Not to mention that there's always a time limit on these, and if you don't manage to complete the objectives within a time limit, it instantly fails the entire mission, and you have to start the entire match over again. And this structure will continue through the entirety of 10 waves. After that, you're given one final wave where the enemies will just constantly assail you, and you need to survive a specific amount of time and make it to an extraction point in order to be able to successfully complete the mission. Once a match is over, regardless of whether it ends in success or failure, you will be given experience points and an amount of credits based on what you earned while you were playing through the match, and you will also earn some galactic readiness, which is something that ties in with the single player. You see, the single player has a mechanic called Galaxy at War. The idea there is that as you continue to complete quests and explore and find war assets and such, you will have a military strength value that will increase. And the idea here is that with higher military strength values, your armies are more prepared to take on the Reapers in that final climactic push at the end of the game. and it does have an effect on the way the ending plays out. Here's the thing though, it's not reliant exclusively on the war assets themselves that you find and earn while you're playing the single player. It's also influenced by the multiplayer and that galactic readiness that you will gradually get as you play multiplayer matches. You see, this will start out at 50%, and in the Legendary Edition it is always at 50% no matter what, even though it does actually show 100% in the menus there. And the way this works is basically a modifier. So, if you have 50% galactic readiness, then whatever your actual military strength is effectively halved. Whereas if your galactic readiness is at 100%, your military strength is just whatever the combined total of your war assets is. This means that if you want to experience the best possible ending where all of the benefits of the military strength value are present, then you need to do one of two things. Either you need to go and scour the entire game for as many war assets as you possibly can find to make sure that your effective military strength value is high enough to where you do actually get those benefits, or you need to play a fair bit of the multiplayer to get your galactic readiness up to 100%, and then you can just get the war assets to your heart's content and have effectively twice the value that you would if you did not play the multiplayer. You may think to yourself, well, what's the big deal about that? Why not just play enough of the multiplayer to get to 100% galactic readiness and then just not really bother with it? Well, for one, it is trying to push people that normally would not play multiplayer because they don't like multiplayer into playing it, and for another, the galactic readiness rating does decay. It's a fairly slow process, but it does decay over time, so you continually have to play multiplayer matches at least every so often in order to make sure it stays consistent. And there's the way they handled the multiplayer progression. You see, you have a variety of character types available to you. Of course, all of the basic classes that you have as Shepard, but in the case of the multiplayer, it is separated into individual character types per class. So you'll have things like a human, adept, soldier, engineer, so on and so forth. But you'll also have things like Drell adepts, or Asari adepts, or Quarian engineers, or Krogan soldiers, or any number of things like that, which each have their own health and shielding values, or of course barrier if they're a biotic class, and they all have their own specific abilities. To give you an example of how this works, a human soldier has health and shield values starting at 500, and they also have the abilities Adrenaline Rush, Concussive Shot, Frag Grenade, and Fitness, which is a passive ability that's available for most of the characters, actually. Whereas a Krogan soldier has 750 health and 1,000 shielding, and has the abilities Carnage, Fortification, Inferno Grenade, and Rage. And all of these abilities can be upgraded in the same way that you can upgrade abilities in the single-player campaign. You'll start off with just a straight linear upgrade, and then you'll be given branching paths after that. The way they handle the progression there is that you will earn experience points as the class you're playing, and that will actually apply to all of the character types within that class. So for example, if you're playing a soldier, and you get a soldier to the maximum level in the multiplayer, which is level 20, then any of the additional soldier-type characters that you have will also be at level 20, and will have the appropriate amount of skill points to be able to allocate them into their powers. When a class reaches level 20, it can be promoted, which will reset its level to 1, resulting in any powers that you've allocated to any of those character types also being reset, but it will then count as a war asset worth 75 military strength in the single player. This probably all sounds fine so far. After all, you've got a wide variety of character types available, you have a pretty straightforward progression system in the sense that you earn the experience points, you gradually level up the classes, that class level applies across all of those character types, and you can allocate the skills much like you can in the single player. The problem is how you actually gain access to all of this content. You see, this is where loot boxes were starting to hit the mainstream, and EA leaned extremely heavily into that in Mass Effect 3's multiplayer, in the sense that if you want to just play the game and unlock a specific class, you can't. If you want to unlock a specific weapon, you can't. You have to buy loot boxes. Now you can do that with the in-game currency of credits, but they are expensive, and especially if you're going for the crates that will actually give you some of the things you want, as opposed to just giving you a bunch of consumable items that you can use while in the matches, or some slight modifiers here and there that you can use to temporarily boost things while you're in a match. You need to be buying the much more expensive packs because they have much higher rarity drops. And guess what the characters and the weapons tend to be? They tend to be the drops of the higher rarities, and you can get duplicates, which is a mixed bag in the sense that it will give you additional experience points for your class if you already happen to have that character type, and it will also unlock new cosmetic options for that character type, but you're still getting a duplicate when you have all of these weapons and all of these character types that you haven't unlocked yet. If you've ever played a gacha game before, or at least are familiar with them, then you'll understand what I mean when I say that it is incredibly annoying when you have all of this tons of content that you haven't gotten to yet, but the game constantly keeps giving you repeats of the same thing over and over and over again, and there's nothing you can do about it. And obviously that frustration scales quite intensely with the amount of credits or BioWare points that you spent on a given pack. Wait, DW, what are BioWare points, I hear you asking? Well, very good question. There's something that was introduced with Mass Effect 2, and it was basically the premium currency that you had to spend money to get in order to then buy the DLCs for that game. Then when Mass Effect 3 rolled around, not only did you have to spend BioWare points in order to get all of the story DLCs, but you could also spend them to get the packs in the multiplayer. Now, like I said, you don't need to spend BioWare points on the various packs. You can spend credits on them, and you earn credits by simply playing the game. Except you don't earn a lot of credits unless you play on the higher difficulty settings. And if you play on the higher difficulty settings, you will find very quickly that it is heavily dependent on what weapons you're bringing in and how upgraded they are. Merely having a level 20 character is not enough at that point, because the enemies are such damage sponges that it becomes downright ridiculous. And while you do still take experience points and credits with you if you fail a match, it's still going to be less than if you made it all the way to Wave 11 and extract with your team. In other words, you have to put in a fair bit of grinding in order to be able to even afford one of the decent packs, and then you still have no control over what you're actually going to be getting from that pack. So the progression in the multiplayer actually ends up being pretty obnoxious, and it was made even more obnoxious with the introduction of all of the DLCs for it. Now, I will be fair, all of the multiplayer DLCs were completely free. All of the content they added into the game is obtainable by simply playing the game. The problem is that apart from the maps and the objectives and such like that they added, which you can just select and play to your heart's content, all of the new equipment and all of the new character types, you have to unlock them through the pack system. And that's not an insignificant amount of content. It's 40 character types over the course of all of the multiplayer DLCs. It's 20 additional weapons over the course of all of the DLCs. Not to mention all of the consumable items and weapon mods and things like that that they throw into the packs on top of all of that. So sure, the DLCs are adding quite a decent amount of content to the multiplayer, but how much of that will you actually be able to experience in any reasonable manner? Not very much of it. You'll definitely be able to experience the new enemy types and the new maps and such, but as for all of the new weapons and character types, well, good luck, you're gonna need it. About the only saving grace of this entire mess of a progression system and the exploitative monetization of it is that it's at least a co-op mode, so you're not paying to have an advantage over other players and thus not pay to win in that sense. But that's really not much of a saving grace for what is ultimately a fairly bland mode that is only okay for an occasional match here and there, and it really demands a lot more of you than that if you want to actually have access to most of its content, and if you want to keep your galactic readiness rating up. So that really covers everything I wanted to say about the multiplayer, and more or less closes out everything I wanted to say about the gameplay mechanics as well, at least in the base game, and including, of course, the multiplayer DLCs. Which means that it is time for me to discuss the story of Mass Effect 3. Now, in order to adequately explain why people hated the ending so much on the game's launch, and to explain a lot of the issues that I'm going to bring up, I'm going to need to spoil the story for you. To that end, I will discuss as much of the story as I can without spoiling it, and then when I hit the point where I really can't go into details without spoiling things, I will go ahead and put up a spoiler warning on the screen. There will be an accompanying time code that you can go to in order to get past the spoiler section. And I will certainly warn you again when that comes up. So what is the story of Mass Effect 3? Well, like I said before, it is the conclusion to Commander Shepard's storyline, starting with Mass Effect 1 and going up to, of course, this game. It is the conclusion of the Mass Effect trilogy. To that end, it takes place about 6 months after the end of Mass Effect 2. And this is immediately a problem if you didn't play Mass Effect 2, and especially if you didn't play the Arrival DLC in Mass Effect 2. Because Shepard starts off the game basically under military tribunal for events that happened during the Arrival DLC. And if it wasn't the Arrival DLC, as in you just didn't have that when you imported your save game, then the game basically hand waves it away as trying you for working with Cerberus in Mass Effect 2. The problem being, if you're not familiar with Cerberus from Mass Effect 1 and 2, you're not gonna understand why Cerberus is a problem in Mass Effect 3, at least not at the start. You will eventually, but starting off, you're just gonna be fairly confused. This will immediately bring me into one of the relatively few problems I can actually explain without going into spoilers here, which is that EA wanted people to be able to jump into Mass Effect 3 and be able to play it from beginning to end without really knowing what happened in Mass Effect 1 and 2. But at the same time, this is the third entry in a trilogy. It builds upon ideas and character arcs and story arcs from both of the previous games. So much so that if you jump into Mass Effect 3, you are not going to have any of the significance of any of those things at all without just delving heavily into the Codex. Which, sure, the Codex does explain a lot of these things, but EA was also hoping to capture some additional audience members with this that weren't familiar with Mass Effect 1 and 2. Which seems like a very odd thing to do, but it actually happens all the time. People will jump into later entries in series like it's nothing. The thing is, that really only works if the stories are self-contained. Think about something like, say, Dishonored versus Dishonored 2. Do you get more out of Dishonored 2 if you've played the first game? Absolutely. But do you need to know what happened in Dishonored 1 to be able to play Dishonored 2? No. It's a self-contained story, and it explains everything you need to know right from the beginning. That's not what you get with Mass Effect 3. Like I said, it builds on the previous two games. So if you aren't familiar with the story and the characters and such from Mass Effect 1 and 2, you're probably going to be utterly lost as to the significance of anything in Mass Effect 3, because 3 does not adequately explain all of these things to the player. There is just too much to explain all of that in detail to a new player. So how did they go about making this thing more palatable to someone who hadn't played Mass Effect 1 and 2? Well, that's where the waters get a lot muddier, because it's hard to tell where the writing incompetence begins and the catering to new players by dumbing things down ends. The dumbing down effect comes in the form of the much more restricted dialogue options, the restriction of the Paragon and Renegade system more into a morality system than what it actually was meant to be in the first two games. It's seen in things like reducing the Paragon and Renegade interrupts down to basically being inconsequential a lot of the time. I mean, to give you a prime example, one of the Paragon interrupts comes up when you're shaking Rex's hand, and all it does is slightly change the handshake. It has no other significance. There's just too much of this oversimplification kind of thing going on to really think of it as just the writers being incompetent. It's clear that they did this on purpose in a lot of instances, and you have to think about why they would do something like that. Well, it's probably to cater to new players who have no idea what's going on. But then at the same time, there's plenty of things the game does well from a storytelling perspective. I mean, the beginning of the game sees Shepard in this military tribunal, and then almost immediately the Reapers show up and attack Earth. And since Shepard has been a thorn in their side for a long time, it makes sense why they would go heavily after Earth almost immediately. And while the opening sequence of the game is certainly an extremely linear, basically cutscene more or less that has some interactive bits between it to give you a basic tutorial on all the movement commands and shooting and squad commands and things like that, it also does a really good job of showing you the kind of threat the Reapers pose. They are basically an apocalyptic event. Their arrival on Earth, and of course the rest of the galaxy, more or less spells the doom of everyone in the galaxy, and thus it's up to Shepard to unite all of the forces of the galaxy together to find a way to defeat the Reapers once and for all and save the entire galaxy. The thing is, if you had played the previous Mass Effect games, you would already know the kind of threat the Reapers pose, but if you hadn't, the intro sequence of the game explains it to you in no uncertain terms. It sets the tone for the game to be rather grim. The idea is that this is an overwhelming force, and you're not sure how you're going to be able to defeat it. Which is, of course, where the plot contrivances start to show up. You see, one of the very first things that happens after you manage to escape Earth narrowly is that you're ordered to go to Mars in order to secure information about a potential superweapon that could be used against the Reapers. This would be known as the Crucible. Where did this information come from? Well, it's always been there. It just needed a specific decryption key that Liara Tassoni just happened to find. And you know what? It's really not that important how we found that information. The important part is what you can actually do with this thing. It's a potential superweapon against the Reapers. Obviously, we need to make it. And in all of this confusion, the group Cerberus attacked the facility in which this information was stored. Who are Cerberus, you might be asking, if you've never played Mass Effect before? Well, they're a human supremacist group led by a guy calling himself the Elusive Man, and while they were certainly antagonists in the first game, they were just a small side group. And then in the second game, it turns out they have quite a lot of resources, and they were able to bring Shepard back to life after some events at the beginning of Mass Effect 2, and thus you end up having a very complicated relationship with them throughout the entirety of Mass Effect 2. They are shown to be an organization that has a lot more nuance to them than you'd really think from just a human supremacist organization like they were introduced in the original game. Then you get to Mass Effect 3, and all of that nuance that was built up in Mass Effect 2, completely thrown out the window in favor of them just being extremely evil. And by that I mean, they are basically space Nazis. And then seemingly out of nowhere, they suddenly have extremely advanced technology, more advanced than everybody else in the galaxy basically, and they have an absolutely massive army that is capable of taking on entire forces from established militaries and such. You really can't help but sit there and wonder, where in the hell did they get all this stuff? Because in the previous two games, they were a shadowy organization that definitely had a lot of resources, sure, but they were keeping everything on the down low. You can't really hide a massive military like what they have in Mass Effect 3, so where they got this is not exactly explained. In fact, the game is more or less like, you know what, it doesn't really matter where all this stuff came from, it just matters that you're going to be fighting it, so just get used to it. And so you kinda have to get used to it. You will be fighting Cerberus constantly throughout the game, almost as much as you fight the Reaper forces. It's actually pretty ridiculous. Anyway, point is that they have attacked this facility on Mars to get the data on the Crucible, this super weapon that supposedly can take down the Reapers, so they can use it for their own nefarious plots. At this point, your squad is going to consist of yourself, along with either Kaidan or Ashley from Mass Effect 1, depending on who survived that game, and a new squad mate by the name of James Vega, who is voiced by Freddie Prinze Jr., and is often the source of a lot of derision, even though he's not really a bad character, it's just that he's kinda bland. I think the developers went into his character with the intent of making him relatable to a wider audience who may not be all that familiar with Mass Effect, so he could ask some of the dumb questions and get the more newbie's perspective on things, so that he could kind of ground the rest of the squad who had been with Shepard for a while, but that only has some mixed success, and if you're already familiar with the rest of the squad anyway, you want to be hanging out with them, you don't want to be hanging out with this new guy who's just kind of a bland character. He's not a bad guy or anything, he's not a bad character, it's just that he's, well, just a soldier. And most people are probably going to swap him out for other squad mates who are much more interesting almost immediately. I mean, one of the very first people you'll run into is Liara T'Soni from the first game and also carried over into the second game, who is finally able to be part of your squad again after you rescue her from the Mars mission. At any rate, once you have managed to get the plans for the Crucible, you make your way to the Citadel, the center of galactic politics, and it's at this point where the story progression in Mass Effect 3 becomes very different from what you saw in Mass Effect 1 and 2. You see, once you get out of the prologue sections of Mass Effect 1 and 2, the games open up a lot more. They allow you to go on various missions in pretty much whatever order you want. That's not the case with Mass Effect 3. The story is told in a very linear progression, mission to mission. You get a new priority mission as soon as you've finished a previous priority mission. That's not necessarily a problem from a storytelling standpoint, but when you're used to the previous two games giving you some freedom to go around and try missions in different orders and such, it's going to come as a mostly unpleasant surprise when you're not able to do that in Mass Effect 3, and you're only able to go on this very specific story path. That issue is mitigated somewhat, however, by the fact that over the course of the story, as you go and try to rally the forces of the galaxy together, you're going to be visiting some interesting locations that have never been really seen before in the Mass Effect series. They'd certainly been referenced a lot, but this is the first time you actually get to see them. And the very first place you're going to be going to after, of course, getting to the Citadel is Palaven, the Turian homeworld, or more specifically the moon of Palaven, where you're trying to extract the Turian Primarch, their leader, in order to be able to represent the Turians as a people and a military when it comes time to get all of the war assets together. And as you continue, you'll visit the Solarian homeworld of Surkesh, you'll visit the Asari homeworld of Thessia, and there's even an entire sequence of liberating the Quarian homeworld of Rannoch. And some of this has been built up quite heavily over the course of the past two games. One of the major missions in this has you going to the Krogan homeworld of Tuchanka, which you had actually visited previously in Mass Effect 2, only this time you're going there to secure a Krogan alliance by potentially curing the genophage, which has been plaguing their species for over 1,000 years with very low viability rates on pregnancies. And I already mentioned Rannoch, but the idea there is that you're ultimately getting the conclusion of several hundred years of Quarian history where they were kicked off their homeworld by their own creations, the AI, the Geth, and now they're coming back to try to retake their homeworld, and you take part in all of that. Things like that are the culmination of 2 games worth of build-up, and those kinds of things are actually handled very well in this game. If you were familiar with them from the previous 2 games, you'll probably be pretty satisfied when you play through those missions in Mass Effect 3 and you get definitive conclusions to things that have been referenced since the first game. And while sure, they do up the action ante quite a lot in this game compared to the previous 2 games, they still manage to handle them in a way that actually ends up being pretty satisfying overall, especially if you have played through the previous games and you import your save and you get to see some of the ramifications of your choices in the previous games. The problem with that, however, is that if you are just jumping in at Mass Effect 3, you can't really get that. You don't understand the real significance of these events, and on top of that, the options you're given for solving them just aren't anywhere near as satisfying as they are if you have imported your save from previous Mass Effects. And this ultimately brings me to the central problem with the storyline of Mass Effect 3. It's a problem of setup and payoff. The setup of things like the genophage cure, the liberation of Rannoch, even to some degree the Reaper War in general, all has its roots in the original Mass Effect, and they developed it throughout Mass Effect 2 as well. Then you get to Mass Effect 3, and they carry those plot threads to a pretty satisfying conclusion. That's not the case, however, with things that were introduced specifically in Mass Effect 3, or that were heavily retconned in Mass Effect 3. In most of those instances, they try to set things up extremely quickly and expediently without really earning the setup. For example, they try to make it seem like the whole war is having a serious effect on Shepard's mental health. You see, at the beginning of the game during the first Reaper attack on Earth, Shepard ends up running across a boy who's hiding in a vent and tries to save him, only for the boy to end up dying anyway. And despite Shepard having been a career soldier for quite a while now, and having seen numerous people, both civilian and military, die over the course of many years, this random boy that Shepard has never seen before, never interacted with before, but just wasn't able to save, is the one thing that Shepard ends up dwelling on throughout the rest of the game. And this will come back when I get into the spoiler section, by the way. Not to mention the massive retcons they made to Cerberus just now being laughably evil to the point of basically being space Nazis. Things like this random dude named Kai Leng, who has never been a thing before in any of the previous games, but he was in some comics that nobody read, so they decided to make him a major character in this, only he only shows up a few times in the entire game and just to be annoying. So they tried to make him out to be some super badass villain that you're supposed to feel super satisfied in taking out, only you really can't because you have no attachment to this character at all. And honestly, how could you? Because the character more or less comes across as a weird hybrid of Sasuke during his super emo phase in Naruto, and Metal Gear Rising's Raiden, at least as far as the aesthetics go. And yet, the game acts like you should know who this guy is, and that you should either fear him, or at least respect him, or something, and you just can't, because you have no idea who this guy is. In fact, your main rationale for wanting to take the guy down, if you're not familiar with the Mass Effect series, is just gonna be, well, he did this one thing that I'm not really sure what the deal is there, other than I guess this was supposed to be important for Shepard, and then he also just happens to be a Cerberus operative, so obviously we need to take him down because space Nazis. If you are familiar with the games, more specifically Mass Effect 2, then you'll probably have more incentive to take the guy down, but it's not going to be because the character deserves it, it's just going to be because he did one thing that was absolutely obnoxious in Mass Effect 3, and he just deserves to have a can of whoop-ass opened up on him for it. But by far the most egregious example of all of this is something called the Catalyst. This is where I have to start putting up the spoiler warning. The basic idea behind the Catalyst is that it is something that is required in order for the Crucible to become functional. And so a major plot point involves trying to figure out what the Catalyst is and where you can get it. And that's about where I can go before I have to start putting up the spoiler warning. So there is a spoiler warning on the screen now. If you don't want the story of Mass Effect 3 spoiled for you, then you need to skip to the time code that I am displaying right now. But I have to give you some major spoilers for you to truly understand why the Catalyst is such a problem in this story. So, you've been suitably warned at this point. If you are not already skipped ahead, then I'm going to assume that you're okay with me spoiling this for you. Toward the end of the game, you have to go to Thessia, which is the Asari homeworld, in order to find something that they have been keeping secret for a very long time. When you get there and find it, you find out that it is actually a Prothean VI, or Virtual Intelligence, and this VI tells you that the Catalyst is actually the Citadel. So you need to combine the Crucible with the Citadel in order to be able to make the Crucible functional. And when this idea is introduced to you, it seems a bit contrived, but it still makes some degree of sense. I mean, the Citadel is this massive, powerful structure that can be used for a bunch of different things, and it may have something to do with activating the Crucible over the mass relay network, so you can at least believe that. But then you combine the two things during the final assault on Earth, and Shepard ends up having to go into the Citadel and into the heart of it in order to be able to activate the Crucible. And this is where you find out, basically completely out of nowhere, that the Catalyst isn't the Citadel. No. It is an artificial intelligence created by the species that would become the Reapers in order to solve the problem of organic and synthetic life. Because, you see, the creators of this intelligence observed over many, many thousands of years that whenever organic life would end up creating synthetic life, basically they would create artificial intelligence, eventually there would be an inevitable war between the creators and the created, and they would end up effectively destroying each other, or one would completely destroy the other. And so they created this intelligence to try to figure out a solution for this problem. And the solution it came up with was creating the Reapers, harvesting the entirety of these civilizations and using it to create a hybrid organic-synthetic being, and just continuing this cycle whenever sufficiently advanced civilizations arose. And it would just keep doing this until it seemed to think it had enough data to come up with a better solution. I feel like I should let you process that for just a moment, but let me rephrase it in a way that will probably make things sound a lot more simple and straightforward to you. This AI's purpose was to find a solution to the perpetual cycle of organics getting to the point where they will create synthetic life that will eventually turn against them and destroy them. And so, this intelligence came to the conclusion the way to prevent this cycle is to create synthetic life that will wipe out all organic life whenever it reaches a point where it could create synthetic life that will overthrow itself. In other words, its solution to this cycle is the cycle, but with ready-made synthetic life providing the destruction instead of synthetic life that the civilization creates. And the way it started this is by making its own synthetic life to harvest the species that created it. And it's just gonna repeat this cycle endlessly until apparently synthetics and organics are ready. Which, in its particular case, doesn't mean they've overcome their differences and live together in harmony. No. It means they're ready to be merged into one being, because you apparently cannot have synthetic and organic life coexisting. That's apparently completely impossible as far as the Catalyst is concerned. I guess never mind that that's the central conflict of the Quarian and Geth War and ultimately liberating Rannoch, and one of the ways you can go about doing this is by basically brokering a peace between the Quarians and the Geth, and then the Geth openly help the Quarians reacclimate to their homeworld. Not to mention that Edie, the Normandy's AI, has been a companion with the crew of the Normandy since Mass Effect 2, and is not only an invaluable tool, but a valued member of the crew. It is abundantly clear by the time you start talking to the Catalyst that organics and synthetics can certainly live together in peace. That the supposed cycle the Catalyst had been created to stop is not actually an infinite cycle. It's something that can be broken. And it doesn't require a merger of synthetic and organic beings to do that. But are you given an option to try to persuade the Catalyst to this? Of course not. You have exactly 4 options that you can choose for how this story is going to end, all of which are presented to you by the Catalyst, which, by the way, creates a holographic projection in the guise of that boy that Shepard was not able to save on Earth and has been haunting Shepard's dreams this whole time. And honestly, I really don't know what BioWare was going for there. The best I can figure is that they were trying to make this sort of getting in Shepard's head, or maybe trying to shove some very cheap attempts at getting emotion out of the player in there, but it just doesn't work. All it really does is serve to make the Catalyst extremely annoying. The way it's done in the game just doesn't earn that kind of reaction from the player. And as the conversation comes to its conclusion, Shepard is presented with 3 options for choosing the outcome of the Reaper War, for ultimately bringing Mass Effect 3 and the Mass Effect trilogy to a conclusion. Option number 1, control. You do what the elusive man thought was possible this entire time, taking control of the Reapers themselves and using them for whatever ends that Shepard ends up using them for. Option 2, do what you set out to do in the first place, which is destroy the Reapers. Only there's a monkey wrench thrown into this because it will also wipe out all synthetic life in the galaxy. Not just the Reapers, but also the Geth and Edie. And option 3, synthesis, where you merge all organic beings together with synthetic life. Basically, you turn literally everyone into an ascended cyborg being. If you choose control or synthesis, Shepard has to sacrifice themselves for it to work. And when I say sacrifice themselves, I mean they are literally disintegrated during this. Whereas if you choose destroy and your effective military strength is high enough, then there's the implication that Shepard survives it. Now of course, if you've been following this series since the beginning, if you've been playing since Mass Effect 1, you know that the only real choice there is destroy. To choose control or synthesis is more or less to go against everything you accomplished in Mass Effect 1 and 2. And yet, if you are familiar with the color coding of the Paragon and Renegade system, the game makes it out like control is the Paragon option, and destroy is the Renegade option. And as I mentioned before, since the Paragon and Renegade system has been reduced into a morality system in this instead of a methodology system, the writers have spent an awful lot of time in Mass Effect 3 more or less persuading you that the Renegade options are not simply evil, they are outright incorrect. That is bad enough. That was enough to irritate the living crap out of Mass Effect fans that have been around since the first game especially, but even ones that have been around since the second game. But then there's the icing on the cake. The people who tried the different endings just to see what they were like. I was one of those people. As it turns out, in the original version of the game, the cutscene that plays is nearly identical across all 3 endings. It's just that one of them is tinted red, that's the destroy ending, one of them's tinted green, that's the synthesis ending, and one of them is tinted blue, that's the control ending. The biggest difference you'll see is between the control and the other 2 endings, because remember, they wanted to make it seem like control was the correct option, which means that there is the least devastation in the control ending. In the other 2 endings, the combined Citadel and Crucible sends out an energy blast that goes through the entire mass relay network and destroys them. The thing is, if you've played the Mass Effect 2 Arrival DLC, then you know what destroying a mass relay does. Because you had to do that at the end of the Arrival DLC. And the sheer amount of energy that released destroyed the Batarian colony on Aratot, which was hundreds of thousands of people. In other words, if you choose the synthesis or destroy endings, then series precedent indicates that since all of the mass relays are being destroyed by these big energy blasts, well, that's gonna wipe out most of the life in the galaxy. Of course, the funny thing about the way the original Mass Effect 3 endings went is that regardless of your choice, after it goes through the pre-rendered cutscene, it plays a sequence of the Normandy going through a mass relay and getting damaged and having to crash land on a jungle planet, and then Joker and another crewmate will step out of the Normandy and observe the planet that they're on, and the game tries to do a callback to the original Mass Effect in the form of playing the Fonts song Das Malefiz, which is a very similar song to the one that was played over the end credits of the original Mass Effect, which was M4 Part 2. And after it goes through the whole credit sequence, it plays another pre-rendered cutscene where a boy asks an older man, well, did that really happen? And the storyteller goes, yeah, but the details were kind of lost over time, but that was the legend of the shepherd. And then it kicks you back to the main menu. Those were the endings to the original version of Mass Effect 3. After all of the adventures you went on in Mass Effect 1 and 2, and even 3, all of those interactions you had with your crewmates, the friendships you forged with them, the impact that you had on the galaxy around you, the problems that you solved, the bringing everyone together, all of that led to an arbitrary choice of do you want your cutscene to be blue, green, or red? That is why people hated the endings to Mass Effect 3 on its original release. That is why those endings were so fucking insulting. It wasn't because characters that we liked ended up dying over the course of the game. It wasn't because Shepard has to make a sacrifice at the end of the game. It wasn't because the game doesn't have a happy ending, although it would be nice for there to be an option for that, even if it was extremely difficult to get. It was because after all of those adventures we went on in the first 2 games, and of course even the 3rd game, after all of those choices we made, all of those decisions having consequences throughout all 3 games, all it led to is a cheaply established Deus Ex Machina that presents you with a choice of whether you want your ending cutscene to be red, green, or blue, and gives you absolutely no indication whatsoever of whether any of your choices actually had any effect on anything at all. It is that setup versus payoff problem that I already mentioned was the main problem throughout all of the writing in this. But it's even worse than all the other times where this becomes a problem throughout the story of Mass Effect 3. Because the endings are so hastily slapped together, so slipshod in their construction, that you can't help but wonder if they just gave a few interns some vague ideas for what Mass Effect was about and said, here, make an ending for this, we need this done now, and we have no time to do it. The end result there is that Mass Effect 3 would go down in legend as one of the worst botched finales of any video game series to date. And backlash against it was so heavy that they couldn't ignore it. They had to do something, and thus you ended up getting the Extended Cut DLC, which was a free update that I will be covering in a few moments. But before I get there, I do want to summarize what the experience of Mass Effect 3 was like when you played it originally when it released. It was a very weird mixed bag. On the one hand, the mechanics definitely saw improvement over the previous 2 games. And there are several sequences in the game that are absolutely fantastic, like going through the Tuchanka sequence where you're ultimately trying to cure the genophage, or doing the liberation of Rannoch. These are moments that Mass Effect fans have been waiting for quite a while. They were built up in Mass Effect 1 and 2, and by the time you get to 3, you actually get payoff for them, and it's good payoff. And it was done well enough that you can do things like say, he is the very model of a scientist Solarian, and probably half the comments section is going to start tearing up. But for every moment of the game that is like that, every moment that is great, you have another moment that's just contrived and out of nowhere and just doesn't work all that well, like the entirety of what Cerberus is doing throughout this whole game. And then in other sections of the game, you'll just have something that's fairly mediocre. It's not particularly good, it's not particularly bad, but it's passable, so you don't really think about it all that much. And so much of the game just comes across as not really being finished, or if it is finished, it comes across as being dumbed down and condensed so that the action game crowd will still be able to play it and follow what's going on. And when you bring all of that together, you ended up with a game that, while it was certainly playable and it had plenty of moments that were fantastic, it was so much of a mixed bag that you can't say it's a good game. You also can't really say it's an outright bad game because for the most part, it wasn't a bad game. It's just that while most of the game is playable or even quite good, once you get to the last couple of hours of the game, the last few missions, it just completely shits itself. And that was ultimately why I originally gave the game a 2 out of 5 back when I first reviewed it when it first came out. That was before the Extended Cut DLC and everything. But these days there's really no reason to play it in its original form. It has a bunch of story DLCs out. It has the Extended Cut DLC, and of course if you get the Legendary Edition, which is readily available these days, that has all of the DLCs included, so what you would be playing is not the same game that would have been available on launch day. Which is why I'm not going to give the game a score summary here. I'm going to wait until I've covered all of the DLCs so you can understand what you're getting in its entirety, not just from the perspective of the original launch version. Because that's what my original review was, and even after I covered the Extended Cut DLC, I didn't have the full picture, because I didn't have the story DLCs back then. This time, however, I have all the DLCs. So we're going to be taking a look at the full package here, and I will assess it at the end of all of that during a conclusion. So now that I've completely talked your ear off on Mass Effect 3's original base game, and for the most part, the story as it still is to this day, except for some of the stuff towards the end with regards to the Extended Cut DLC. Let's go ahead and actually start talking about the DLCs themselves, and we'll do that in release order, starting with From Ashes, because that was available on launch day. So we'll cover that, then we'll cover Extended Cut, then Leviathan, then Omega, and finally Citadel. So let's go ahead and get started with From Ashes. Now, funnily enough, there's really not all that much to talk about as far as the From Ashes DLC is concerned. As I've mentioned before several times at this point, it was a Day 1 DLC that was included as part of the N7 Collector's Edition and N7 Digital Deluxe Editions, which were much more expensive than the standard version of the game, of course. But it was also put up for sale for those of us who did not have that particular edition as an 800 BioWare point purchase, which of course you have basically no real frame of reference for, but suffice to say, when they did release this for normal currency, instead of their idiotic BioWare point premium currency, they made it available for $10 US. And keep in mind, that's more or less a purchase for content that was already in the game, but they cut out to sell as DLC. And what do you get for your purchase? Well, you get an additional outfit for your squad mates, a particle rifle, which frankly isn't all that good from what I've messed with, 2 missions, which are Priority Eden Prime and Eden Prime Resistance Movement, so you're going back to a location you visited in the first game, and the biggest thing you get is the squad member, Javik, the last living Prothean who has spent this whole time in stasis. And of course, Priority Eden Prime is the mission where you go to get him, because you hear that Cerberus has found a Prothean artifact, and if Cerberus has found something like that, it's not good news, so you need to go prevent them from having that. In doing this, of course, you will open up the sarcophagus that Javik is stored in stasis in, and after you wake him up, he ends up joining the squad and will accompany you for the rest of the game. And given the sheer lore importance of the last living Prothean in a Mass Effect game, as well as the fact that Javik does have voiced lines for a lot of the stuff you will be encountering throughout the entire game, it's pretty obvious they intended him to be in the game from the beginning. As you would expect, he provides a pretty interesting outlook on the galaxy. Not only is he able to inform you quite a lot of Prothean culture, but he also very frequently remarks about how much the galaxy has changed since his cycle, and the change of how all the creatures that were considered primitives in his day are now what are ruling the galaxy. So, Solarians, Asari, Turians, humans, etc. And he has some very snarky things to say about pretty much everything. So he runs the gamut from being very insightful and interesting as far as the Prothean culture and history goes, to just being generally insulting, which is a lot of the time, and even being just downright amusing in a lot of the very snarky things he says, because he has a very much take no crap from anybody attitude. Now, as far as his general role in the squad goes, he has some biotic abilities, including a unique one called Dark Channel, which will envelop an enemy in a damaging biotic field, and if you favor a biotics-heavy playstyle, or you're looking for somebody to fill in the biotic role in the party, then he makes a good option for that. So Javik does end up being a rather solid companion, both from the fact that he is an interesting character, both lore-wise and personality-wise, and from his utility to the squad. That said, the From Ashes DLC is just the character, along with the particle rifle, alternate outfits for all of your squad mates, and 2 missions. And if you play through those missions, you're looking at maybe an hour of gameplay at absolute most. This is a DLC that simultaneously adds one of the most lore-important things to happen in really the entirety of Mass Effect 3 in the form of the last living Prothean, and yet it's extremely light on actual content. As a result, it just does not remotely live up to its purchase price. $10 is way too much for this thing. Like I said, this is content that really should have been in the game already to begin with, and yet they cut it out and used it as a Day 1 DLC, so frankly, it's pretty insulting. Obviously, if you have the Legendary Edition and all the DLCs included, then you're not necessarily going to notice that, though. You're just going to get this mission, Priority Eden Prime, and you're going to be, okay, cool, you're going to go do that. It's going to feel like a normal mission that you would go on anywhere else, and you're going to get Javik, and you're going to feel like it's a pretty natural part of the game. But it's just downright insulting as a DLC that you have to pay extra for. Thankfully, the next DLC I'm going to talk about was not something that you had to pay for, because it would have been even more insulting than From Ashes, and that is the Extended Cut DLC. Now, the Extended Cut was a direct response to the massive backlash the game got over its incredibly rushed and nonsensical ending, and it was released as a free DLC about 3 months after the original launch of Mass Effect 3. And what you're ultimately getting here is an expansion of the very end of the game and really not much else. Now, in order to adequately explain the kind of changes this made to the game and the real impact it had on the endings, I am going to have to spoil some things for you. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a time code up for those of you who really want to avoid the spoilers in this regard, and you can skip straight to that to just get to the end of the Extended Cut DLC section here. But before I get to that, I do want to mention that if you were going into, say, Legendary Edition, or you had picked up the game after the Extended Cut DLC was made available, then you may not necessarily understand why people were so irritated at the original endings, which is why I discussed them previously. Because the Extended Cut DLC does fill in some of the blanks, it does clarify some things that were left completely ambiguous or just ignored entirely in the original version, and it adds some additional epilogue content after the main cutscene plays to give you an idea of the impact some of your decisions had. And where that time code will skip to will explain the impact this has. So I'm going to go ahead and start getting into spoilers now, so consider yourself warned. What you're actually getting with the Extended Cut DLC is mostly some changes to the very last mission of the game. So the last mission more or less ends with Shepard and the rest of the forces just charging straight at the Citadel beam in order to get in there and activate the Crucible, and Harbinger shows up to start blasting and incinerating things with a particle beam. Toward the end of all of this, Shepard got severely wounded, but still managed to make it to the beam, made it into this Crucible, had a showdown with the Elusive Man, with Admiral Anderson there with him, and while things will play out in a bit of a different way depending on how Shepard interacts with these scenes, the Elusive Man and Anderson will both end up dead by the end of it, and then it's off to talk to the Catalyst and get the choices for the red, green, or blue ending. There was a lot of stuff about the original endings that was just nonsensical or not explained in the slightest. Things like, how did your squad mates that were with you during the final mission get back on the Normandy and manage to escape? How did the Normandy know to fly away at the time? What happened to basically everybody now that the mass relays are being destroyed and all that sort of thing? And it's mostly those kinds of gaps that the Extended Cut is meant to fill. It does change some things about how all of this works. The effective military strength value plays more of a role in Extended Cut than it did in the original version of the game, although it did play a slight role in that as well. To give you some prime examples, in the Extended Cut version, when you're doing the charge to the beam, your squad mates will either be injured if you have a high effective military strength value, or if you have a low value, then Harbinger blasts them into space dust. Another instance where the EMS value is going to make a difference is during the ending cutscene where it's showing you the effects of the Crucible and everything. If you have a high EMS value, then you'll get a few extra scenes showing the Reapers being defeated on other planets than just Earth. Another big thing that changes depending on the EMS value is that if you have a low EMS value, then when the energy pulse gets shot out by the Crucible, it causes all the mass relays to explode, but if you have a high EMS value, then they only start breaking apart a bit instead of sending out a massive energy blast that would effectively wipe out all life in the galaxy. Regardless of the EMS value, however, you do get a fair few extra sequences in the cutscenes, and you also get some extra sequences in the build-up to those, where it tries to fill in some of the gaps here and there, like when the Crucible starts firing off, then you get an announcement from Admiral Hackett that the Crucible is firing and everybody needs to fall back to the rendezvous point. And then there's a sequence showing Joker in the cockpit of the Normandy frantically hitting a bunch of things, and then the crewmates are trying to persuade him that they need to get out of there, and that's basically how it explains how the Normandy got away from everything. And then after all of that, you end up with a slideshow that gives you an overview of the aftermath everybody was experiencing following the Reaper War, if they managed to survive anyway, and that includes both the various species as well as your crewmates. And while all of these various changes do help flesh out the endings a bit more, and certainly make them a lot less terrible than the absolute train wreck they were in the original release, the endings to Mass Effect 3 still aren't very good. I mean, sure, you do get an epilogue now. You at least get a slideshow explaining some of the decisions that you made along the way and how they will impact the galaxy going forward. You do get some kind of epilogue for at least some of your squad mates, and it does fill in some of the gaps that were in the original endings of the game, but at the same time, the actual quality of the content you're getting in the Extended Cut DLC is really not all that great compared to the rest of Mass Effect 3. There's still a sense of vagueness about it. There's a sense of some of the ending changes just having been thrown in there specifically to address some of the biggest concerns people had about it, and not really to fix a lot of the problems that the basic choice of control, synthesis, or destroy had. Hell, they even threw in a fourth ending choice, and while you might think, well, that's great, that would be the optimal ending, but no, that's not how it goes. The fourth ending choice is refusal. In other words, when the catalyst gives you the three options of destroy, synthesis, or control, you say, nah, to hell with all that stuff, we'll find our own way and do this right. But then the catalyst basically says that you're an idiot, and the game laughs in your face by giving you the worst option out of all of them, which is that if you choose the refusal ending, the Reapers win. They harvest all of the organic life in the galaxy, the cycle continues, and you get a sequence that has an audio log by Liara that basically says, here's all the information we were able to obtain, we leave this to you, whoever's coming in the future, in the hopes that you will break the cycle. Now, some of you might be going, but DW, you cleared out the spoilers section, that was a spoiler. Well, in this particular case, I really don't care, because that ending is so bad that you have to be warned against even trying it. The refusal ending is basically BioWare extending both middle fingers to the fans and saying, no, you can't have an alternate method. It has to be red, green, or blue. It has to be our way or the highway. And that goes back to the attitude that some people had toward people complaining about the endings in the original release, being like, oh, you're just a bunch of entitled gamers, because you want the developers to compromise their artistic vision. Well, I guarantee you there was no artistic vision to the original endings, and really there's not an artistic vision to the extended cut endings either. They're more or less the equivalent of polishing a pile of dung. No matter how much you do that, it's still a pile of dung. Simple fact of the matter is that to get a good ending out of Mass Effect 3, a proper ending to the Mass Effect trilogy, not just something that was effectively red, green, or blue cutscenes, but with some very slight tweaks here and there, you would basically have to rewrite the entire story of Mass Effect 3, at least apart from the stuff that actually worked in it. And obviously, that wasn't going to happen with the Extended Cut DLC. So while it does certainly help, it's not a silver bullet for this game's woes. And there was also a bit of an oversight in the sense that Extended Cut's endings, even after all the patching and everything, don't include any of the content from Leviathan, Omega, or Citadel. It only covers the content that was in the original base version of the game, and to a very, very slight extent from Ashes. So the stuff you experience in Leviathan, Omega, and Citadel is more or less self-contained. We'll get to those in a moment, but when they didn't even retroactively do anything with the Extended Cut endings to at least somewhat cover what happens in those DLCs, it just shows a lack of attention to detail that was present throughout the entirety of Mass Effect 3 anyway, but it's also there when you get to the endings and even after the DLCs. Now don't get me wrong, I understand that it's not that big of a deal, and it's something where the Extended Cut was released before those DLCs were even a thing, but at the same time, how hard would it have been to just throw an extra slide in during the slideshow at the end just to give you an indication of at least something happening in those locations and with those characters and such. And thus, even with the Extended Cut DLC helping to some degree, you still have that really nasty problem of setup versus payoff that was a problem in the base game when it originally released as well. They simply didn't do enough build-up to make the endings of Mass Effect 3 work. They still basically come out of nowhere. They are barely explained even with the Extended Cut DLC, although it's better than the explanation in the base game. And two of the endings still contradict and invalidate everything that you were working towards in the first two games. Not to mention that all of the problems I explained with the writing in the base game are still present as of the Extended Cut DLC and all the patching. They didn't fix any of that, they just threw a couple of things in at the ending and hoped that that was enough. Unfortunately, however, it wasn't, and they decided to continue the train wreck when they made the Leviathan DLC. So let's go ahead and just start talking about it. So what is the Leviathan DLC? Well, the basic idea is that Shepard gets some news about something being in the galaxy somewhere that is powerful enough to kill a Reaper, which, needless to say, sounds like it could be extremely useful in the fight against the Reapers, and so Shepard sets off to try to find more clues to the whereabouts of this thing, and potentially add it as a war asset. And thus you head off to meet with the leader of the task force that's looking into this whole thing, Dr. Garrett Bryson, and when you get there, you run into a snag almost immediately, because as he's starting to explain things to you, his research assistant starts showing signs of indoctrination and shoots the doctor before he can really reveal anything. You then start investigating the lab with Edie and start putting the pieces together until eventually you start gaining some leads, and this will lead you on a journey across the galaxy in search of the Leviathan. And unlike the From Ashes DLC, which was really only 2 missions and was extremely short, this is actually a relatively involved mini-campaign. You'll go on a series of missions investigating the various leads, and as you investigate, you'll start running afoul of the Reapers, who are also trying to find the Leviathan. So it ultimately becomes a sort of race against time, where you're trying to get to the Leviathan before the Reapers do, and the DLC actually does a pretty decent job of building up to the inevitable showdown with whatever this Leviathan is. The problem goes back to that central issue I've talked about with the writing in Mass Effect 3 several times at this point, setup versus payoff, or build-up versus payoff. And the build-up to finding the Leviathan itself is fine, and finding the Leviathan and figuring out what it actually is pretty cool. But there are ultimately 2 major problems with it. The first of them is a setup that has no real payoff, which is the mech suit. The Leviathan DLC actually gives you a vehicle to pilot around, specifically a mech suit with a big cannon on it, which is pretty cool, you would think. You can drive it around for all of maybe 5 minutes before the Leviathan DLC's over. You use it to fight a small number of Reaper forces that you'd be fine handling even without the mech suit. It just makes them go more quickly. You don't get a big boss fight, you don't get any sort of cool mech suit mechanics or anything, just very, very brief section that is ultimately wasted on that. That's pretty unfortunate from a mechanics standpoint. I mean, even Mass Effect 2 had the Firewalker DLC, which gave you at least a few missions to play around with and use a vehicle. Here you don't even really get to mess around with the mechanic all that much. It's a glorified turret sequence, and then you're just walking forward, and that's pretty much it. But the other major issue is with regards to the actual storyline of Leviathan, and for that I need to put up the spoiler warning again. So by this point you know what to do in that regard. You've been warned. Suffice it to say, the Leviathan DLC is more or less what you would expect once you start to realize that indoctrination is involved and whatever it is could actually destroy a Reaper. It is the precursor species to the Reapers. It is the species that ultimately created them. More specifically, it is the species that created the Catalyst, which is the AI that gave birth to the Reapers. And the Leviathan DLC more or less exists to show you that there are still a few of the Reaper's species still around, and then it also goes on to tell you a bit more about what the Catalyst actually is and why it is the way it is. The reality of the matter is it's more or less just doubling down on a really bad decision with regards to the Catalyst, where that thing was a blatant Deus Ex Machina that comes out of nowhere, and it still is, but then they made the Leviathan DLC to retcon in some vague explanation, which is to say that it's an AI that was created to solve the problem of the inevitable cycle of organics creating synthetics, and then those synthetics rebelling against their masters and resulting in chaos and devastation. And so it creates the Reapers, a synthetic species to harvest all organic life in order to continue the cycle, because that's its solution. I've already gone over this in the story section of the base game, and the thing is, the base game didn't really explain this all that well. Most of the explanation you get is in the extended cut, and then the rest of the explanation is retconned in with the Leviathan DLC. The thing is that in the original version of the game and the extended cut, the only thing you really got about the catalyst before the very end of the game was this thing is needed to be able to complete the Crucible, and we don't really know what it is. Then you get to one of the last missions and it's revealed that the catalyst is actually the Citadel, so you end up connecting the Citadel to the Crucible, and when Shepard enters the Crucible after the ending charge, you get the revelation that the catalyst is not the Citadel, it's actually the AI that the Reapers created, or rather the species that created the Reapers created. It's a mess, and in its original form, when the game first released, it made less than no sense. It came out of absolutely nowhere, and everybody was like, what in the hell is this? So instead of doing, well, the sensible thing, and more or less cutting that out of the game and doing something completely different with the way the endings worked in the extended cut, they said, no, we're going to keep this, and we're just going to add a few extra lines of dialogue to try to explain kind of why this thing is important and what it is. And then when that still wasn't enough, it's like the Leviathan DLC was created specifically because they're like, no, screw it, we need to put something in the game earlier so that it doesn't just come out of nowhere. Well, the problem is that if you're selling that as an extra DLC, it's not part of the natural story progression, and it's still something that the player can ultimately skip over. This ultimately means we have 2 attempts at correcting the endings of Mass Effect 3, first in the extended cut and second in the Leviathan DLC, and they were both more or less the equivalent of putting a bandage on a tumor. The difference between them, though, is that the extended cut was at least a free update, and the Leviathan DLC is something that they charged $10 for. It's certainly a more substantial DLC than From Ashes was, but that's not really saying much, considering that it's got about 2 or so hours of gameplay as opposed to the roughly less than 1 hour that From Ashes had. It still just ended up being not remotely worth the extra price. So that leads us to the next DLC, which was finally not an attempt to try to correct the endings of Mass Effect 3. That would be the Omega DLC. The Omega DLC released about 3 months after the Leviathan DLC, and unlike the previous 2 DLCs, Extended Cut and Leviathan, which were mainly centered around fleshing out the endings, both in the sense of fleshing them out directly in the Extended Cut, and giving something vaguely resembling a background to the completely ridiculous things that happened in the endings in Leviathan, Omega involves a complete side story in the sense that you are told that Cerberus has invaded the space station Omega, and they've taken over the station for their own nefarious purposes and kicked out its former, air quotes, ruler, because there's not really a ruler on Omega, Aria T'Loak. Those of you who've played Mass Effect 2 will remember her as the crime lord that you interacted with a fair bit on Omega, and as you might expect, the story of the Omega DLC involves gathering an army with Aria and then using that army to stage an invasion of Omega and kick Cerberus off of the facility. If you're able to do this, then Commander Shepard will have access to all of the resources that Aria and Omega are able to bring to bear, which could prove very useful for the war effort, at least thematically, but we'll get to that in just a moment. The DLC changes things up quite a bit from everything else that happens in Mass Effect 3, including all of the DLCs, by more or less functioning as a detached mini-campaign. Once you start on the Omega DLC's main missions, you're going to be on Omega until the DLC is complete. And unlike the rest of the game, you'll only have access to one squad mate throughout the entire thing, which is Aria T'Loak herself. At times you'll also get access to a second squad member, Nyreen Kandros, a Turian mercenary who previously had a relationship with Aria T'Loak that turned sour, and while her reasons for being on Omega are initially unclear, it's revealed pretty quickly why she's actually there. And as you might expect, their roles within the squad are that Nyreen is a bit more of a tech-oriented character, although she does have some biotics, and Aria is basically a biotics powerhouse. Now, as far as what you actually get in the Omega DLC, you have that sort of mini-campaign, you have those 2 squad mates, and you have roughly 2.5 to 3 hours of gameplay. This, interestingly enough, actually includes some additional weapons, as well as 2 new enemy types. The Adjutant, which is a sort of Reaper abomination that is billed up as being this massive new threat, but then you actually fight it and it's a complete pushover, so that's a bit awkward. and the other one being the Rampart mech, which is basically a Cerberus riot control mech that they employ to try to keep the populace of Omega in line, and it can bring up a shield and also creates a small field around its corpse that will actually electrocute you if you get too close. Despite initially giving you the appearance of giving you a new hub in the form of Arya's bunker, you actually don't really have a hub mission structure here. It's a very linear progression where you just go on each individual mission. It's just that between some of the missions, you go back to the bunker in order to regroup, rearm, maybe buy some upgrades, maybe complete some side activities like giving some extra access to one of Arya's hackers or something like that. And then you just go right back out and continue the very linear story path of Omega. As far as the quality of the content goes, well, like I said, the adjutants are a complete pushover. The Rampart mechs actually pose a bit more of a threat than the adjutants do. But the actual story of the Omega DLC is fine. There's nothing particularly great about it, nothing particularly bad about it either. And by the end of it, you do have a bit more insight into the character of Arya T'Loak if you were interested in that sort of thing anyway. Not to mention, you now know what a female Turian looks like because we just didn't have one in the series prior to the Omega DLC. But other than that, the Omega DLC doesn't really go anywhere. The self-contained Omega DLC ends, and it's never referenced at any other point in the game. It's not referenced in the epilogue after the extended cut endings and everything. You don't hear news outlets talking about it or really anything. The only person who remarks about it is Arya herself, who has been hanging out in the Purgatory Bar on the Citadel the entire time, and that was well before the Omega DLC was even a thing, and even after the Omega DLC is done, then she's still hanging out in the Purgatory Bar. Despite the impression that kicking Cerberus off of Omega is some sort of major victory, you never really get that actual impression through actually playing through it and seeing what you get at the end of it. Because at the end of it, all it does is add a few extra war assets to the list of war assets you already had. So you get about 400 or so extra military strength points, but that's really the only lasting effect that the Omega DLC has, which is really disappointing. It's certainly not that the Omega DLC is not decent to go through. I mean, gameplay-wise, it's fine, it's interesting enough, it plays perfectly fine. It has a competent enough story that unfortunately is just rather self-contained, and having the extra war assets is nice if you're going for the most optimal ending, but is it worth the asking price of $15 US? Not really. You're just really not getting a good value proposition out of the Omega DLC. That is, if you're having to buy it on top of the base game like I did. Obviously, if you get it bundled together with all the other DLCs and the game, then that's less of a problem, and obviously Legendary Edition has a bit of a leg up in that regard. But as a DLC, Omega is pretty underwhelming overall. This, of course, leads me to the final DLC for Mass Effect 3, which is the Citadel DLC, released a day short of being a full year after the original release of Mass Effect 3. And the idea here is that in order for some repairs and retrofits to be made to the Normandy, the crew is given some much-needed shore leave, and so they end up going and trying to get some relaxation in. And while Shepard and Joker go to a sushi place, they suddenly find the place under attack by unknown mercenaries. It turns out someone is targeting Commander Shepard with a nefarious plot, and you end up having to get together with the entire Normandy crew, past and present, that are still surviving anyway, and find out who's behind this plot and how you can put a stop to it. And what ensues is almost a completely different game from everything else you've messed with in the entirety of Mass Effect 3. I mean, sure, mechanically it's still Mass Effect 3, but it's like a completely different writing team took hold of the Citadel DLC. And that's a good thing, not because the writing in Mass Effect 3 is so bad, but because the Citadel DLC is a completely different tone. It is a lighthearted romp where you're going on a completely ridiculous storyline with the entire crew of the Normandy one last time to get that final hurrah in. And you can more or less think of it as a celebration of everything that Mass Effect was up to that point. It is constantly poking fun at all the ridiculous situations and the absurd odds that the Normandy's crew have found themselves in over the years. The squad themselves are constantly making silly and snarky comments to each other, poking fun at each other's abilities or lack thereof in some instances. And it's poking fun at the enemies you're fighting as well, by you just absolutely decimating them, and over time they just start realizing what a horrible mistake they've made going up against you. And when the mastermind behind this nefarious plot is ultimately revealed, you can't help but chuckle at it because it's just so ridiculous that it's impossible to take seriously. But that's really the idea here. The Citadel DLC is not meant to be something serious, and every single character in it who does take things seriously soon find themselves on the receiving end of the Normandy crew's ridiculous shenanigans, and it is wonderful.
This is Shepard. We need...
That's why I love hanging out with you guys. Why shoot something once when you can shoot it 46 more times?
The DLC just adds some much-needed levity to the proceedings that was sorely lacking in Mass Effect 3 in general, and it brings back some of that sense of adventure and fun that was present in the previous Mass Effect games. I mean, sure, it's more or less a glorified fan fiction as far as its actual plot goes, but that's kind of the point. It's meant to be something that the fans can just play through and have a good time with as one last ridiculous hurrah of the Normandy crew. A much-needed break from all of the doom and gloom that the rest of Mass Effect 3 is. And it even closes out with a party you can invite all of the surviving members of the crew to and just have a good time with. On top of that, there's also some extra scenes to help kind of give some closure to certain characters, as well as some extra scenes for the romances, including romances with characters that were not available with the squad in Mass Effect 3. And on top of all of that, you get a new area to mess around with, which is the Silver Sun Strip on the Citadel. It's basically the entertainment district. There is an arcade there where you can play some arcade games. There is the Armax Arena, where you can have some combat simulator stuff. There's a casino that you can go to hang out at the bar or just mess around with the various casino games. And there's also an apartment that is given to you by Admiral Anderson for your purposes of shore leave and such on the Citadel, basically to look after it while he's busy on Earth. And you can even change out some of the furniture and decorations with that. It's also the most intensive gameplay-wise out of all of the various DLCs, because you're getting roughly 3 to 4 hours of gameplay from the actual storyline within it, and then you're getting however much time you want to spend on all of the extras that come with it, the arcade games, the arena, that sort of thing. And when you bring all of that together, you end up with the definite best DLC that was available for Mass Effect 3, and frankly, the most fun you're going to have playing the entire game. The asking price of $15 is definitely a bit steep for it, but it's the only one where I can really say that it was worth getting as an extra DLC. It's just a shame that the way Mass Effect 3 ultimately says goodbye to all of the good times, all of the crew interactions, all of the adventures you had over the course of the entire trilogy, is something that came out about a year after the base game released, and you have to pay extra for it. Well, except, of course, the Legendary Edition, because, as I've mentioned before, all of the DLC is just included with that version. So that more or less concludes everything I have to say about all of the various DLCs for Mass Effect 3. The only one I actually consider to be worth buying as an extra, as an actual DLC, is the Citadel DLC. Extended Cut was obviously a free update, so there's not much to worry about there. But even something like From Ashes should have just been included in the game from the start. Frankly, the Leviathan DLC should have been included in the game from the start. That way, it would have at least had some setup for the absolutely ridiculous out-of-nowhere nonsense that was in the original endings. And Omega, well, it's a side story, but it definitely could have been implemented better in the game overall. But what about when you take it all together and look at it as an overall package? The base game, along with all of its DLCs, including the Extended Cut update, and even including the multiplayer DLCs. How is it as a game in and of itself, and more importantly, as a sequel and the conclusion to the other two games in the Mass Effect trilogy? Well, as I mentioned before, it's such a mixed bag that it's hard to really classify it in one way or another. On the one hand, you have all of the mechanical changes that ultimately led to this being mechanically the best game in the entire trilogy. On that same hand, you have some of the conclusions to plot threads that have been around since the beginning of the series, stuff like liberating Rannoch, as well as the curing the genophage plot arc. Moments that, in the grand scheme of things, are handled rather well, that provide a rather satisfying conclusion to those plot arcs. And of course you could say that the entire Citadel DLC is on that hand as well. And those are the high points that will ultimately carry you through the entire experience. But then, on the other hand, you have the rather thrown together and overly reliant on Deus Ex Machina plot. You have all the abject stupidity of the Catalyst and everything that it represents. You have endings that, even with the Extended Cut DLC, ultimately invalidate basically everything you were working for in the first two games, and the gross oversimplification of Paragon and Renegade just being turned into good and evil in a really slipshod way. You have plot contrivances that come out of nowhere and make little to no sense, and you have large swaths of the game being simplified to the point where they're barely more than a third-person shooter, and not really so much the role-playing games we came to know and love with the first two games. You have shady business practices in the form of the Day 1 DLC From Ashes, not to mention all of the loot box crap in the multiplayer mode. And then you have the things that fall somewhere in between those, like the multiplayer mode in general, which is just present. It's not terrible, but it's not good either. You have things like the Galaxy at War mechanic, which is not bad, but it's not good either. It's just there. And then of course it's hard to escape the idea that the game is just unfinished. You'll be playing as you normally would, and you'll just run across things that are awkwardly clipped, or seem like they don't serve much purpose, or just full of weird glitches that don't necessarily break the experience, but are certainly noticeable and kind of annoying. And when you bring all of that together and examine it thoroughly, what you end up with is a game that is not a good conclusion to the Mass Effect trilogy. It's not a worthy successor to the other two. For everything it does well, there are multitudes of other things that it just doesn't do well or outright does poorly. And while it is certainly better as a whole after all of the DLCs were out and all the patches were put out, and they retooled some of the ending and such, it's still ultimately a rather weak conclusion to the Mass Effect trilogy, and as such, I can't give it anything higher than a 2 out of 5. Unfortunately, for all of that build-up, all of that goodness that we got in Mass Effect 1 and 2, what it was ultimately leading to was a conclusion that sends the Mass Effect trilogy out not with a bang, but with a whimper. Thank you all very much for watching. This was not an easy video to make, not just from the fact that it was about 300 gigabytes of raw footage that I recorded for this thing, not just for how long it took to record and then occasionally have to re-record sections of all of the commentary that I was doing, and of course all of the editing I had to do to get this thing all put together. Now, funnily enough, the most difficult part of making the video wasn't all of that process. It was playing through the entire Mass Effect trilogy again, because I really enjoyed Mass Effect 1 and 2. Going through them again for the Reduxes was just fun to do. It was nice being able to play those good games again. And then it all led to this. I was kind of dreading doing the Mass Effect 3 Redux because I knew what it was like playing this thing originally back in the day, and even with the extended cut. And I thought that it being almost a decade later, I had gotten all of the bitterness out of my system, and of course there would be the new DLCs that I would be going through for the first time, so it would be a bit of a different experience, and I would at least look forward to trying those out. But that was actually kind of the problem. Because between the relatively fresh experience of having gone through Mass Effect 1 and 2 again, and experiencing all the fun that those had to offer, and going through Mass Effect 3's new DLCs, I actually ended up with a pretty similar experience to what it was like playing through the original version of Mass Effect 3 when it first launched. Sure, this time around I knew that there were going to be some sections of the game that were done better than others, like liberating Rannoch and doing the whole genophage bit. But then I would get to one of the DLCs, and I would start playing that, and it would be something different, and it would kind of shake up the whole experience enough to where I wasn't fully ready for going back into the stuff that I was familiar with, and I ended up with that same feeling of disappointment all over again. that's ultimately why it ended up taking so long to get this video done compared to the other two Mass Effect Reduxes. Going through the first two games again was a great time. Motivation was high for them, and I managed to get them out in fairly short order. Going through Mass Effect 3 again, though, it's just that roller coaster of a moment that's really good followed by moments that are really awful. And that actually ends up being worse than if a game were just bad or just boring. It just makes it that much more difficult to summon all the mental fortitude you need to be able to push through it. So for everybody who's been waiting for this Mass Effect 3 Redux for quite a while now, thank you all for being very patient with me over the years for this. I hope you all enjoyed it, and I will see you all in later videos.